The golden hues of the morning sun stretched over Jason Carter's sprawling farm, a picturesque landscape of green fields and rustic charm. For years, his land had been his sanctuary, a place where he could work in peace, tend to his animals, and enjoy the simple joys of country life. He had no need for nosy neighbors or city folks with their rules. Unfortunately, his land had become a target for something he despised, an overreaching HOA. Despite not living in an HOA-controlled community, a group of homeowners from a nearby suburban development had recently formed an unofficial association. Led by a woman named Margaret Thornton, whom Jason privately referred to as Queen Karen, they had taken it upon themselves to enforce community standards beyond their neighborhood, extending their grasp to areas that were never part of their jurisdiction. And for some reason, Jason's farm was at the top of their list. At first, it was just annoying letters left in his mailbox. Your barn is an eyesore. Your animals are too loud. Your fencing doesn't match the aesthetic of the neighborhood. Jason ignored them. His farm had existed long before that cookie-cutter subdivision was even built, and he wasn't about to change a thing for a bunch of self-important busybodies. But then came the first real confrontation. One crisp Saturday morning, as Jason finished feeding his horses, a black SUV pulled up his dirt driveway. Out stepped two men dressed in what looked like police uniforms, except something was off. Their badges were unfamiliar, their belts lacked real police gear, and their demeanor felt staged. One of them, a stocky man with a forced, authoritative tone, stepped forward. "Sir, we've received multiple complaints regarding code violations on this property," he announced. "You need to comply with community regulations or face legal action." Jason narrowed his eyes. Something wasn't right. He leaned against the wooden fence, arms crossed, sizing them up. "You boys don't look like county officers," he said slowly. "Mind showing me some ID?" The man hesitated. His partner, a lanky fellow who seemed nervous, shifted on his feet. Jason had seen enough in his life to recognize when someone was bluffing. His gut told him these men weren't real law enforcement. They were HOA goons playing dress-up. Then, just as he expected, Margaret Thornton emerged from the SUV, adjusting her designer sunglasses and giving Jason a smug smile. "These gentlemen are here to enforce community guidelines," she declared. "If you refuse to comply, we'll escalate this matter further." Jason let out a slow breath, feeling the fire rise in his chest. This wasn't just a nuisance anymore. This was trespassing. This was impersonating law enforcement, and if Margaret thought she could bully him into submission, she was in for a rude awakening. Jason stared at the so-called officers, his jaw tightening. He had dealt with stubborn folks before, but this was a new level of ridiculous. "You boys really gonna stand there and pretend you're cops?" he asked, his voice calm but edged with warning. The stocky man cleared his throat. "Sir, we're here on official business, if you don't cooperate." Jason held up a hand, cutting him off. "Official business, huh?" He turned to Margaret, who was smirking like she had already won. "Tell me, Margaret, where exactly did you rent these clowns from? They don't even have real badges." Margaret scoffed, feigning offense. "Jason, this isn't a joke. The Homeowners Association has received multiple complaints." Jason laughed, shaking his head. "Let me stop you right there. I don't live in your HOA, never have, never will, so you can take your community guidelines and shove them back into whatever nonsense rulebook you made up." The lanky officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, if you don't comply, we'll have to issue a citation." Jason raised an eyebrow. "Oh yeah, what kind of citation? Go on, tell me. What law am I breaking?" Silence. The men exchanged awkward glances. Margaret huffed in frustration. "We're trying to maintain a certain standard. Your property, your barn, your fences, your animals, they don't fit the aesthetic of the community." Jason let out a slow, exasperated sigh. "You mean your community, that I'm not a part of, on my land?" Margaret's lips pressed into a thin line. "The town is expanding, Jason. More people are moving in. We have to keep things orderly." Jason looked at the fake cops again, shaking his head. "And impersonating law enforcement is your way of keeping things orderly." The stocky man stiffened. "We are not impersonating officers." Jason pulled out his phone. "Great, then you won't mind if I call the sheriff's office to verify that." He started dialing. Margaret's smugness wavered. Now, Jason, there's no need for that. We can settle this reasonably. Oh, I agree. That's why I'm calling the real cops, Jason said, putting the phone to his ear. Let's see what they think about you sending in fake officers to harass me on my own property. Margaret's face paled. The two men exchanged another nervous glance, realizing they were in deep trouble, but Jason wasn't about to let them off the hook. This wasn't just some HOA nonsense anymore. This was a serious crime, and he was about to make sure they faced real consequences. Jason watched as Margaret's confidence cracked. The fake cops who just moments ago had tried to act tough now looked like two kids caught sneaking out past curfew. But he wasn't about to back down. The phone rang twice before a familiar voice answered. Sheriff Dawson speaking. Hey, Sheriff, it's Jason Carter. I've got a situation out here on my farm. There was a pause. What kind of situation? Jason smirked at Margaret, whose face had gone pale. Well, I've got two guys here claiming to be law enforcement, trying to issue citations over some made-up HOA rules, but I don't think they're real cops. Silence, then a sharp, serious tone. Say that again. Yeah, Jason continued, eyes locked onto the fake officers. They pulled up in an unmarked SUV, no real badges, no county insignia, and they're trying to enforce community guidelines on my property. Sound legal to you? Margaret suddenly stepped forward, waving her hands. Jason, hang up. This is unnecessary. We're just trying to talk. Jason ignored her. The sheriff sighed. I'll be there in 10. Keep them there. Oh, don't worry, Jason said with a grin. They aren't going anywhere. He ended the call and crossed his arms. Well, fellas, you heard the man. Sheriff's on his way. I suggest you stay put unless you want to add fleeing a crime scene to your list of mistakes. The lanky fake cop gulped and turned to Margaret. Mrs. Thornton, maybe we should. Stay quiet, Martin, Margaret snapped. Then, forcing a strained smile, she turned back to Jason. Jason, listen, this is all a misunderstanding. Jason tilted his head. Oh, because from where I'm standing, it looks a lot like trespassing, harassment, and impersonating law enforcement. But hey, maybe I misunderstood. The stocky fake officer gritted his teeth. Look, pal, we weren't impersonating cops. We're just community officers. Jason chuckled. Community officers, for an HOA I don't belong to, that's cute. Margaret's desperation was starting to show. Jason, let's just forget this happened, all right? No harm, no foul. Jason shook his head. Oh no, Margaret, you don't get to pull this stunt and walk away. You wanted to enforce rules? Well, now you're about to find out what real enforcement looks like. A dust cloud appeared on the horizon, Sheriff Dawson's cruiser speeding down the dirt road. Margaret visibly tensed. The fake cops took a step back, but Jason made sure they didn't run. Oh, this is gonna be good, he muttered, smirking as the sheriff's sirens blared. Sheriff Dawson's cruiser rolled to a stop, kicking up dust as the engine hummed to a halt. He stepped out, adjusting his hat, and took one long, hard look at the scene before him. Jason stood casually by the fence, arms crossed, while Margaret and her two officers looked like a trio of kids caught stealing from a candy store. Dawson walked up to Jason first. All right, tell me what's going on. Jason didn't even try to hide his grin. Well, Sheriff, these fine folks showed up claiming to be enforcing HOA rules on my property. Only problem is, I don't belong to an HOA, and these two geniuses here, he gestured toward the fake cops, tried to play lawman to scare me into compliance. Dawson's expression darkened as he turned to Margaret. Mrs. Thornton, care to explain why you're sending out fake law enforcement? Margaret plastered on her best, I'm the victim here, face. Sheriff, this is just a misunderstanding. We weren't trying to impersonate officers. These are community enforcement representatives. Dawson's eyebrows lifted. Community enforcement representatives? He turned to the two men. You two got badges. The stocky man hesitated before producing a cheap plastic ID card. Dawson took it, inspected it, then let out a scoff. Security consultants, he turned to the lanky guy. And you. The man fumbled out an identical ID. Dawson's lips twitched in irritation. So let me get this straight. You two are nothing more than hired security guards, and yet you showed up here pretending to be law enforcement." The stocky man stiffened. "We never said we were police." Dawson let out a slow, unimpressed breath. "You showed up in a black SUV, wearing uniforms that resemble county officers, and started threatening a property owner with citations." That sound about right. Neither of the fake cops answered. Margaret, clearly realizing things weren't going her way, tried again. "Sheriff, please, this isn't a big deal. We were just trying to ensure the community stays respectable." Dawson turned to her, eyes sharp. "You don't have jurisdiction here, Margaret, and hiring security to intimidate people, that's not just unethical, it's criminal. You and your boys here could be looking at impersonation charges." Margaret paled. "Oh, come on, that's ridiculous. We were just trying to encourage compliance." Jason chuckled. "Encourage, that's what you call trespassing and harassment." Dawson pulled out his radio. "I'm gonna need another unit out here. Possible charges for trespassing and false representation." Margaret's face twisted with panic. "Wait, Jason, be reasonable. We don't have to involve more police." Jason smirked. "Oh, but Margaret, you were the one who wanted rules enforced. Now you're getting exactly what you asked for." As the distant sound of another siren grew closer, Jason could see the sweat beading on Margaret's forehead. She had played her hand, and now she was about to face the consequences. But Jason wasn't done yet. If Margaret thought this was over, she had another thing coming. Because now, it was time to really make her regret messing with him. Margaret paced anxiously as the second patrol car approached, her bravado crumbling with each passing second. The fake cops stood stiffly beside her, their earlier arrogance replaced with nervous silence. But Jason, he was just getting started. Sheriff Dawson leaned against his cruiser, arms crossed. "Margaret, let's be clear. You hired unlicensed security, dressed them up like real officers, and sent them onto private property to intimidate a landowner. You realize that's a crime, right?" Margaret clenched her fists. "It wasn't intimidation, we were just—" Jason interrupted, his grin widening. "Just what, Margaret? Reminding me to keep my farm aesthetically pleasing for your precious HOA?" He shook his head. "Nah, you went too far this time." Margaret turned to Jason, desperation creeping into her voice. "Look, Jason, maybe we got a little carried away, but you don't want this to go any further, do you? I mean, we're neighbors. We should be civil." Jason feigned deep thought. You're right, Margaret. We should be civil." Then his smirk returned. "That's why I'm gonna be real polite about making sure you never pull something like this again." Margaret's eyes narrowed. "What do you mean?" Jason glanced at Dawson. "Sheriff, I assume these guys being fake cops means they shouldn't have been flashing any kind of authority around town, right?" Dawson nodded. "Correct. If they've been intimidating people under false pretenses, we'll need to investigate that." He turned to the two security guards. "Might want to start talking, gentlemen. Where else have you been enforcing rules?" The lanky one, Martin, swallowed hard. Just here, mostly." Dawson's brow lifted. "Mostly." Jason let out a mock gasp. "Oh dear, sounds like Margaret's little army has been causing problems all over town." He turned to Margaret with a devilish grin. "You know, Margaret, I think people should know about this." Margaret's face drained of color. "No, Jason, don't." Jason pulled out his phone. "Oh, absolutely, With a few quick taps, he opened a community Facebook group and began typing. "PSA, if two guys dressed like cops show up at your door threatening HOA violations, don't be fooled. They're fake. And guess who sent them? None other than Margaret Thornton. Apparently she thinks she runs the whole town now. Might want to ask her why she's playing sheriff." Margaret lunged toward him. "You wouldn't dare." Jason held up the phone, letting her see the post before hitting submit. "Too late, Margaret. Enjoy your 5 minutes of fame." The moment he pressed send, her phone started buzzing wildly. People were already commenting. Her name was about to be dragged through every neighborhood chat in town. But Jason wasn't done yet. He had something even better planned. If Margaret wanted to enforce rules so badly, he was about to make sure she followed every single one down to the letter. And he had just the idea to make her life miserable. Margaret's face turned an alarming shade of red as her phone continued buzzing with notifications. The town wasn't wasting any time tearing into her in the comments. Jason leaned against the fence, watching her panic with a satisfied smirk. You can't do this," she sputtered, clutching her phone like it was a lifeline. "You're making me look like a criminal." Jason shrugged. "Funny, I thought impersonating law enforcement was a crime." He turned to Sheriff Dawson. "Speaking of which, what kind of trouble are we looking at for our friends here?" Dawson crossed his arms. "At minimum, trespassing, harassment, and misrepresentation of authority. If the DA, feeling ambitious, maybe even impersonating an officer. And if they've done this anywhere else, that's a whole mess of additional charges." The stocky fake cop turned to Margaret, his face twisted in panic. "You said this was legal." Margaret waved her hands, barely holding it together. "Oh, for heaven's sake, it was community enforcement. That's not illegal." Dawson pulled out his notepad. "Tell you what, Margaret, why don't we let the county judge decide that?" Margaret let out a frustrated growl and turned to Jason. "You think you've won? This little stunt won't change anything. We're still going to expand our HOA jurisdiction. And if you think this town will side with you over progress, you're delusional." Jason chuckled, shaking his head. "Oh, Margaret, you really don't get it, do you? You wanted rules enforced. Well, let's enforce some real rules." Her eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" Jason grinned. "I did a little digging after you first started harassing me. Turns out your property isn't exactly up to code either." Margaret stiffened. "That's ridiculous." Jason pulled up an email on his phone. "See, I called up the county zoning office. Turns out that fancy deck you had built last year unpermitted. And those hedges blocking your neighbor's driveway, violation of public access laws. Oh, and the best part, that little decorative pond you had installed encroaches on county land." Margaret's face went from red to pale in an instant. You're lying." Jason smirked. "Am I?" He waved his phone. "Because the county inspector I spoke to seemed very interested in coming by for a formal look." Margaret's breath hitched. "You wouldn't." "Oh, I absolutely would," Jason said. "In fact, I already sent the request." Dawson let out a chuckle. "Guess you're about to get a taste of real enforcement, Margaret." Margaret looked like she was about to explode, but before she could respond, the sheriff's radio crackled. "Backup unit en route. Officers on the way for pickup." Jason turned back to Margaret with a grin. "Hope you like following the rules, Margaret, because something tells me you're about to have a lot of them to deal with." Margaret stood frozen, her perfectly curated world unraveling before her eyes. Her phone continued buzzing with notifications, the town's residents already feasting on the drama. Meanwhile, the fake cops looked like they wanted to sink into the dirt and disappear. Just then, the second patrol car pulled up, and two uniformed deputies stepped out. Dawson greeted them with a nod. "All right, boys, we've got a situation here. Two men impersonating authority under the orders of Mrs. Thornton." The stocky fake cop, now sweating profusely, stammered. We didn't say we were cops, we just strongly implied it." One of the deputies gave him a deadpan stare. "Aha, that'll go over real well in court." Margaret snapped back into action, her voice shrill with desperation. "Wait, Sheriff, please, this has all been blown out of proportion. We can talk about this." Jason chuckled. "Oh, we are talking about it, Margaret, just in a more official capacity than you were expecting." The deputies approached the fake officers. "Hands where we can see them, we're taking you in for questioning." The lanky one, Martin, let out a defeated sigh. "Told you this was a bad idea," he muttered as the deputies led them toward the squad car. Margaret looked on in horror as her enforcement team was escorted away, her jaw clenching so tightly Jason thought she might break a tooth. "This is humiliating," she hissed under her breath. Jason leaned in slightly, just enough to make sure she heard him. "Good. Maybe next time you'll think twice before trying to strong-arm people." But the best part was still coming. As if on cue, another vehicle pulled up, a county-issued truck with the words zoning and code enforcement plastered on the side. Out stepped a man in a clipboard and vest, looking around curiously. I got a request for an urgent inspection. Margaret's entire body went rigid. No, 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 not today. Jason put on an expression of exaggerated surprise. Oh wow, that was fast. Must have been all those violations I reported. Margaret whipped around to glare at him, her eyes burning with fury. You vindictive little. The inspector cleared his throat. Mrs. Thornton, I assume we need to discuss some potential zoning and structural compliance issues on your property. Margaret was seething, but she couldn't refuse. With the sheriff and deputies still present, she had no choice but to nod stiffly. Fine, let's get this over with. As she stormed toward her car, Jason called out after her. Hey, Margaret, you wanted rules to be enforced. Consider this my community service. She didn't turn around, probably because she knew if she did, she'd have to face the victorious grin on Jason's face. Jason watched with immense satisfaction as Margaret stomped toward her car, her entire world crumbling under the weight of the same rules she had tried to shove down everyone else's throat. The zoning inspector was already making notes on his clipboard, rattling off potential violations. So about that deck, if it's unpermitted, it'll need to be either brought up to code or torn down, the inspector was saying. And that pond encroaching on county land, that's gonna be a serious issue. Expect some hefty fines. Margaret visibly flinched at the word fines. Her perfect suburban queen act had completely fallen apart. She spun around and glared at Jason. I hope you're happy. Jason grinned, leaning lazily against the fence. Oh, Margaret, I haven't been this happy in years. The sheriff, still watching the scene unfold, let out a chuckle. Well, Jason, looks like your HOA troubles just solved themselves. Margaret huffed, crossing her arms. I'll be fighting these charges, you know, and as for you, Jason, this isn't over. Jason tilted his head in mock curiosity. Oh, you gonna send more fake cops? Maybe hire a pretend judge to convict me too? He chuckled. Face it, Margaret, you lost, and if you know what's good for you, you'll keep your HOA nonsense on your side of the road from now on. Margaret's face twitched, but she had no comeback. With the entire town roasting her online, her fake cops being hauled in, and her property under county investigation, she had no more power plays left. She turned on her heel, muttering to herself as she got in her car and slammed the door. The zoning inspector continued making notes, looking completely unfazed by her tantrum. Jason let out a satisfied sigh, turning back to his farm as Margaret's car sped away. The sun was shining, the birds were chirping, and best of all, his land was finally free of HOA nonsense. Sheriff Dawson tipped his hat. Well, I'd say you handled that just fine, Jason. Jason smirked. I told her from the start I don't do HOAs. With one last glance at Margaret's retreating car, Jason headed back to his barn, whistling as he went. Peace had been restored, and thanks to a little well-placed karma, Margaret had finally learned a lesson she wouldn't forget anytime soon.